Hi there, everybody. This is Joe Firestone, your host on the Four Progressive Short Takes. And in this short take, I'm going to continue to discuss how we might pay for the Green New Deal. Actually, the title of this short take is Paying for the Green New Deal. So there we are. I want to start by sharing with you a part of a video from the Real Progressives the book club. And the video focuses on a question and answer by Rowan Gray concerning whether the $1 trillion coin was actually gimmicky. So I'm going to go through the question. Okay, then I'm going to go through the various aspects of his very long answer. And I'll be stopping the video from time to time to comment, okay, and to amplify. So let me share the screen now. And here we are. And please let me know if I'm sharing both the picture and the sound successfully, because that will be important for you. Okay, of course.
So it also often depends on the kind of thing we're doing with it.
Why do some people say that mint the coin is gimmicky? I mean, to me, it makes so much sense. So there's probably an accounting thing going on there, but I don't know what it is. I mean, Mosler also says it's a gimmick. So do you mind explaining that?
Yeah, I mean, I love Moser. I've learned a lot from him, but he has an unfortunate habit of assuming that anything that he doesn't understand has no value.
Okay, so in case you missed that, this was a comment, okay, by Rowan saying that the kinds of answers that are given to things like this by Warren Mosler, well, perhaps he doesn't fully get the whole context of which ought to apply to his answer on this. I think that's what Rowan was actually suggesting here, and that is made more clear by his amplification. So here we go with that.
I wish he wouldn't do, because there is value to a gimmick in and of itself. But the reality is that there are two layers here. One is that when there are different ways for the Treasury to get money out to people, but right now the Treasury doesn't have a digital currency infrastructure of its own. Right? If you want money to get into people's bank accounts, it's going to go through the Fed. And there's two ways you can really do that. One is you can ask the Fed to spend on behalf of the Treasury, and the other is you can create money at the Treasury and then deposit at the Fed and demand the Fed do with the Treasury's money what it was going to do otherwise.
Okay, so these two ways relate to things that I have been advocating for some years now. First, of course, is the use of the platinum coins. 1 ounce platinum coins, when minted by the Treasury, create essentially money by the Treasury. That money can be deposited at the Fed. The Fed puts the $1 trillion coins into its vaults and replaces them with reserves that go into the Mint's account, which in turn can be swept by the Treasury into the Treasury spending account, and you have reserves then that are in the Treasury spending account that can be used to spend the appropriations, of Congress. So that's the first method, the Treasury creating money. The second method is having the Fed spend on behalf of the Treasury, not actually spend on behalf of the Treasury, but provide the reserves in the Treasury spending account, which the Treasury can use to spend the appropriations of the Congress. That corresponds to a second method I've been advocating for years, which is overt congressional financing. And I'll get into that also sometime later. So we get back to Rowan again.
Now, at a consolidated level, when you zoom out from the Treasury and the Fed, it's all government money. But at a deconsolidated level, those differences are real, right? There are situations where different departments of the federal government have gone to court with each other, where one Secretary of Education has a fight with the Secretary of Treasury. The fact that it's all part of the government isn't the end of the story. It's a useful layer of analysis to remember this is all happening sort of in-house. But even within a company, you can have a fight with the sales department and the research department or something. The fact that it's all one company doesn't mean that there's no intra sort of departmental tensions or differences. And so one of the reasons we set up with the coin was because if you're going to set it up so that the Treasury just tells the Fed to let the Treasury run an overdraft at its Treasury account, which is entirely possible to happen in the past, it would be just as much law to change as the coin. The effect of that, psychologically and politically, is it's the Fed's money. The Treasury has borrowed the money from the Fed. The Fed has monetized the debt. And that...
What Rowan is focusing on here is two different things. First of all, the politics internal to the government. That not only relates to the Treasury and the Fed, but also the politics between the Congress, and the Treasury Department. So in other words, Congress has passed, actually way back in 1917, it passed a debt limit act, a debt ceiling act. And the absolute amount of the debt ceiling is renewed actually very frequently because Congress itself appropriates funds or spending, I should say, that very often brings the Treasury up against the debt ceiling, which mandates that actually the Treasury cannot spend because it's hitting up against the debt ceiling, and the situation is one where the Treasury Department is in conflict. On the one hand, it has the debt ceiling. On the other hand, it has the appropriations of Congress, which it is mandated to spend. So Congress is putting the Treasury into a double bind. It's all internal to the government. It doesn't matter at the consolidated level because eventually the appropriations of Congress will be spent, but the internal politics of that impacts the rest of the country and our real lives very greatly. The reason why is because when the government hits a debt ceiling crisis, then very often the government is paralyzed for a while, doesn't get its spending out. This has an impact, on all of us. And on other occasions, what happens is to resolve the deadlock, suddenly the Congress either goes back on its previous appropriations or compromises what happens in future appropriations because that's what's necessary to get over the deadlock in Congress concerning whether to raise the debt ceiling or not. So the debt ceiling gets to be a very, very important issue. It doesn't have anything to do at the consolidated level with whether the government eventually spends its congressional appropriations, but it can impact what appropriations are there to spend. So this internal politics is extremely important. And one of the interesting things about the platinum coin solution to various problems is that it gets by these political conflicts. So the political aspect of things and the psychological aspect of things both are very, very important. Okay, Rowan is also addressing these things here when he points out that from the standpoint of the public looking on at all this, it is very, very important to have a solution which basically means that the money being spent is the money Congress appropriated, is the money the Treasury created, rather than the money that was created by the Fed. There are all kinds of reasons for that, including the fact that there are many people who think that the Fed is a private institution, in spite of what the Fed says on its website, which basically says it is part of the government, though it doesn't get directly funded by the Congress. But it makes clear on its website the Fed considers itself a part of the federal government. That doesn't stop lots of people from the private sector saying, no, the Federal Reserve Bank is a private entity because the regional Fed banks are technically private in a very funny way that we're not going to go into here. Okay, but what Rowan understands, and what I understand, which Warren Mosler evidently does not, is that the political aspects of the interplay between the Fed and the Treasury are very important. And the psychological aspects in terms of what people see and whether they think this is Congress's money and Treasury's money as opposed to the Fed's money becomes very, very important for the politics of the thing. So going on.
Just brings you into this world of you're undermining Treasury Fed independence. You're basically doing all the things that we're told for years you can't do with central banks. And
so again, the difficult politics of the thing. If it's Treasury money that is being used, as it would be in the case of the platinum coin, then if you give the ability to the Fed to issue its own securities, then you get by the problem of undermining the independence of the Fed. And that's why that particular ability, which was built into the Automatic Booster Communities Act, is so important before that act. Because even though the Treasury is forcing the Fed to add but to the reserves at the Treasury Department in return for the platinum coin, the act is also giving the Fed the ability to continue to use monetary policy without having to go to the Treasury to get the Fed to issue new debt instruments or new debt securities, because under the act, the Fed is given the capability, which it does not have now, to issue its own securities to continue to practice the monetary policy that it wishes to practice. Going on.
Maybe some people want to fight that fight. I have no problem with that. I've fought it in other contexts. We didn't want to fight the fight. The point of the coin was we don't need to ask the Fed's permission. We don't need their help on this. We don't need their infinity sign. The Treasury has its own infinity sign, and it can use that. And so our goal here was to liberate the Treasury from that reliance on the Fed. In Warren's perspective, that's irrelevant because it's a fake reliance anyway. I don't agree that politically it's fake. It's operationally unnecessary. Politically, it's very real. And as someone that's actually been fighting a lot of this stuff, while with respect to Warren, he's been down in the Virgin Islands, it isn't politically costless to just assume that the Fed can buy those things. We actually.
Okay, and of course, that's true. Okay. That's a very, very important part of the picture. You can't assume that the Fed, okay, can automatically buy the debt, okay, if it wants to. You have to provide it with the political authority to buy the debt. If you want to go that way, if you want to monetize the debt by having the Fed actually buy the debt, then it's important for the Fed to have that authority, which it does not have it now, and which it would get from the Automatic Boost to Communities Act.
Actually have to make the political case for that. So that's why we thought having the Treasury issue its own money was better than just letting the Fed run an overdraft on behalf of Treasury. Beyond that, yeah, sorry.
People who are new the point is that the Treasury can't just print money, but it, for some reason, can mint a coin.
The Treasury can print paper notes, those US notes that I mentioned before, those greenbacks, but there's currently a legal cap of 300 million. The reason the coin came into kind of popularity was because there was a point during the debt ceiling crisis in 2011 and 12 where a lawyer named Carlos Mucha, who popularizes MMT blog comments back when there were a lot of MMT blogs.
Okay, just a couple of comments on this, extremely short. I think the limit is actually 400 million as opposed to 300 million. I admit I haven't really checked, okay, of late, but I seem to remember that figure from back in 2011 or 2012. And secondly, but Carlos Mucha did the first posts on the platinum coin, but he used a handle during these posts, and the handle was actually Beowulf. So if you look back at the original posts, okay, but some of which hinted at the way this could be done, and that they were done in the summer of 2010. But the first full-length post on this was done by Beowulf under the handle, okay, Beowulf, okay, at Fire Dog Lake. And that post was a very, very important post, and it occurred on January 3rd of 2011. So just to clarify that, in other words, if you look for Carlos Mucha, it may or may not come up with references to the original posts on the platinum coin, and maybe not at all in terms of the post of January 3rd, 2011, which later became a very, very important post, because I followed up with a post on that on January 5th of 2005. And then it was Warren Mosler himself on January 20th of 2011, who ran a discussion on this that was very, very extensive, and it involved something like 400 comments with a lot of sophisticated people contributing to this, and it brought up just about every issue that came up with respect to the platinum coin in the past 10 years. Those issues were first actually brought up in this discussion on Warren Mosler's own site, because when the idea was first suggested by Warren, he became very, very interested in it. He wasn't actually negative about it, okay, at that time. He was very, very, very interested in using it, or in thinking about it anyway. And you have to see the full commentary, and to do that, I think you have to go back to the archive, okay, the Internet Archive, and the Wayback Machine. to actually see the commentary, which was very, very important commentary at that time. Got a lot of people involved, okay, in the platinum coin. Tens of people at first, that later mushroomed into hundreds of people. The platinum coin issue first exploded in the summer of 2011, first at the end of June, the beginning of July, and lasted for all of July because a debt ceiling crisis, okay, was going on there. And it was just exploding into the mainstream at that point. And it was the people who became aware of it in January who helped to really explode it during the summer of 2011. In other words, during the Obama administration is when it first appeared. So, and it became especially important even more than in the summer of 2011. There was a second debt ceiling crisis in December and January, actually December 2012 and January 2013, where the platinum coin really exploded into public notice and national consciousness, okay, at that time. So that's the history, a little bit of history on that. I know this is not going to be such a short take, but actually I planned that from the
who
start.
frequented those, found an obscure provision of the Coinage Act that under existing law, without changing a single law, said the Treasury Secretary can mint and issue a coin of whatever denomination it wants. So, back when the Civil War happened and those greenback laws were put on the books, 300 million was a lot of money. It was a huge amount of money, but 300 million is peanuts today. And so the fact that the Treasury can print $300 million of greenbacks would fund the US budget for about 25 seconds. Whereas minting a coin of $100 trillion in value, as Joe Firestone recommended, would basically end any need to issue Treasury securities at all without even changing anything about the existing accounting relationships.
Okay, so just another comment. It was not actually I who first suggested the $100 trillion coin. During the summer of 2011, what I was at first thinking about was a $30 trillion coin. And I did a post on a $30 trillion coin, which actually had a fantasy speech by the president justifying the use of the $30 trillion coin. Well, shortly after I was thinking about the $30 trillion coin, I started thinking in terms of a $60 trillion coin. And the reason why I used the figure $60 trillion coin is I was thinking, well, okay, I want something that would serve as a trial period for using the platinum coin. And I figured a $60 trillion coin would retire all the debt and then would also take care of deficit spending for I don't know, maybe 10 to 15 to 20 years, depending on how large the spending was. So I was thinking along those lines. However, Stephanie Kelton, bless her heart, was thinking in terms of the marketing. And she was thinking in terms of what would work as a meme. And so, to my knowledge, she was the first one who mentioned the possibility, okay, of minting a $100 trillion coin, because $100 trillion coin, of course, a nice round number that sticks in the imagination. So she mentioned it a few times, and I think she was also responsible for the mint the coin hashtag on about Twitter. Though sometime later she backed away from the $100 trillion coin, and to some degree she backed away from the mint the coin as a hashtag, okay, as well. And I think this was because of the fact that she got involved in Washington, D.C. politics in 2015, and she didn't want to be viewed as crazy as she got involved in commentaries on national shows. So she retreated in a very marked way from the idea of the $100 trillion coin. Okay, but anyway, it was only after Stephanie suggested the $100 trillion coin that I began to recommend it. In my mind, okay, the marketing bowed to the more operational reasons why I originally thought in terms of a $30 trillion coin and then a $60 trillion coin. I wasn't putting on the marketing hat, okay, at that time. Though sometimes I do put a marketing hat on, as you'll see in just a short time. Anyway, I wanted to correct the record on that.
Now, when we proposed it in a law, in a bill, we could have just changed the law. We could have just changed the law to allow them to issue more greenbacks and those kinds of things. But the $1 trillion coin was already in people's psychology. It was already in the popular consciousness. It had been discussed at the top levels of the legal world. It had been discussed by people like Paul Krugman. It had been discussed on TV. Jon Stewart, The Daily Show, had talked about it. And so we started with that as a very important symbolic intervention. And this is where the gimmick thing, actually, we did a podcast with my organization's podcast, Money on the Left, with myself and Nathan Tankus about this, which I highly recommend checking out, where we said, look, it is a gimmick, but it's a good gimmick. All accounting is a gimmick, and this is a gimmick that teaches something really important. And one of the things that it teaches is that we don't have to go into all that complicated shit with the Treasury and the Federal Reserve. All that stuff is an explanation of how stuff works today, but it could be as simple as minting a single coin. And that simplicity is actually a very powerful educational device. The other thing is, coins are something that people always associate with money from little children, right? Abstract accounting is very hard for people to get their head around. The problem with coins is that it usually gives people the idea that the value is tied to the metal, right? Coins in ancient Greece, well, it's about gold, all that kind of stuff. The beautiful thing about $1 trillion coin is there's no way in hell a coin this big is worth $1 trillion in metal, right? So it kind of leans into the physicality of money, which is not real, but it does so in a way that blows it up. It makes it impossible for you to believe that this coin is valuable because of the metal in it. It's valuable because of the number on it. And that's what that tension, that cognitive dissonance is productive in our view.
It is also productive, in my view, because what it makes very clear is the fiat character, okay, of money. Since the coin cannot be worth the $100 trillion or even the $1 trillion or the $25 trillion or $30 trillion, it becomes clear to people that it's the face value of the coin, which is determined by fiat, specifically by the decision of the Secretary of the Treasury, that makes the coin worth the $25 or $30 trillion or $100 trillion. That's the issue. What the Secretary is going to have the mint actually write on that particular coin. So it's important from the standpoint of teaching a lesson of the fact that government money is fiat money. It's important from the communications point of view, from the symbolic and psychological point of view, okay, as Rowan so well points out, okay, in these answers. It's also important in terms of the symbolic and communications aspect because it's been in the press so much. It's been taken up. It is there already in people's consciousness and imaginations. Sometimes it's there in a very negative way. Many people said, no, if we do this, we'll become a banana republic. And, it's so silly. It doesn't make any sense. But it forced people to think about it. And it made it clear to many people, the government has the power to mint as much money as it wishes to mint. That lesson was being driven home as it's being driven home here by Rowan in a really great way. Here we go.
So when we lent into the coin, we did it intentionally for its sort of aesthetic implications as much as its operational implications. Operationally, it's sound, right? It's as sound as anything else. Pedagogically, it is very, very different to, we'll just mark up the account fee. So when Warren says it's not necessary operationally, but it may be valuable pedagogically in a way that his alternative is not.
And of course, I completely agree with it. That was one of the reasons why I became fascinated by the platinum coin and why I've advocated for its use for all these years since I first heard about it in the waning days of 2010. Okay, and actually, Carlos Mucha and I talked about his doing a blog post on it, and I pushed him to do the blog post for Fire Dog Lake that he did on January 3rd of 2000. So I had some part in persuading him to actually do that critical blog post. And then I followed up with a further blog to try to publicize it. And that's what caught fire with Warren. And then he contributed so much by putting the discussion on his blog. Okay, so whether or not he was sorry about that later, I don't know. But of course, it never would have gotten that currency without Warren's efforts to consider it on his blog, because at that time, his was the influential blog. His was the blog, or at least one of 2 or 3 blogs, that all the people who were interested in MMT were going to. The others were, of course, the UMKC blog, and but also Bill Mitchell's Billy blog, of course. Those were the 3 most important blogs at that time. And Warren's blog actually giving attention to this was just so very critical.
And this was from Rashida Tlaib's office,
Yes, the ABC Act, the Automatic Boost to Communities Act.
Which I've discussed, of course, a few times on these shows as well. That was wonderful work, okay, that Rowan did in helping Rashida Tlaib to craft her bill. And as he said before, it was a wonderful thing to get her hashtagging Mint the coin and Pramila Jayapal too, because that keeps the idea of the $1 trillion coin and spreads it within the ranks of the CPC at least, and more generally actually within the ranks in Congress, okay, as well. They know that the platinum coin, okay, is a reality, that it can be used, that it's actually gotten into a bill that has been introduced into the Congress. And of course, it gained some currency on Twitter. Also, once again, because Pramila Jayapal was tweeting about it and Rashida Tlaib, okay, was tweeting about it. So, going further.
Yeah, I liked her little hashtag that she had going on.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? Rashida Tlaib, I love her, and she spends her time thinking about how to help people on the ground. But she's not some abstract central bank treasury operator. You know, her eyes would glaze over before you got 5 seconds into that conversation. We got her tweeting hashtag Mint the coin. And we got Pramila Jayapal, the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, doing that as well. And so whatever, you know, if anybody really thinks that we would have gotten the same thing if I'd walked in and used Warren's approach, they're deluding themselves. So he thinks it has no value. Well, we had 25 members of Congress, including some of the most leading congressional progressives, support something that he never got achieved. So
Yeah, so there it is. Okay, what Warren tried to do, of course, was in the earlier days, 2009, 2010, he spent some time here in Washington talking to Congress people over a period of time trying to convey the MMT ideas and leaving his books, okay, with the Congress people. And he spent earlier days than that, way earlier than that. He talked to Larry Summers. He talked to Al Gore. He talked to a number of people in banking, okay, in government, to try to convey the basic ideas, okay, of MMT there. And all the people he talked to basically said, this is not something I can say. This is not something I can put out there. This is not something that it is politically feasible to educate about. By the way, that's still a problem today. That's still the problem today. But Warren's approach, basically, okay, an education approach, that was a very long-term approach. And MMTers have been following that approach since the early 2000s. Okay, and while it's been gradually successful and is starting to pick up now, to accelerate now in terms of its success, and has had a considerable degree, okay, of uptake, a lot of that uptake has occurred because the education has been accompanied by some success in the political world, specifically Stephanie's getting on to Bernie's campaigns, okay, and also her becoming his chief advisor for the budget committee in the Senate in 2015 and the early part of 2016. But so that was very, very important in terms of accelerating the education. But there's still a case where there's a lot of education still to be done, because the education doesn't work as fast as actually getting this directly into the political arena, getting it into bills, because that forces people to get educated about it, because it brings it into their sphere of practicality, of psychological practicality.
You can do your own assessment of how valuable that is.
Will there be a need to issue securities if you have that platinum coin?
No, there's no need, but there may be still a desire to do so. So the way that we set up the ABC Act was the Treasury would issue the coin, but we actually gave the Fed the power to issue securities if it wanted to. So remember how I said it doesn't matter how the Treasury starts, the Fed finishes, right? The one caveat to that, which I didn't mention then, so I guess I'm glad I got a chance to caveat it now, clarify now, is the Fed could, if the Fed is buying and selling Treasury securities, it can only sell as many as it's previously bought, right? And Nathan Tankers, my colleague, has written a lot about this, which is one of the problems with monetary policy is to be credible in enforcing monetary policy, you have to be able to buy and sell as much as necessary. But for the Fed to be able to sell as many securities as necessary, it needs access to securities. And in what's happened in the past has been that the Fed will call up the Treasury and say, hey, you need to issue more securities. And the Treasury will say, well, we don't need to. We've already funded, we've already got a positive balance in our account. We don't need to issue more. The Fed will say, I know you don't need to. We need you to. And the Treasury will do it. But the problem, of course, is that then that shows up on the national debt and people think we're borrowing from our grandchildren and China and all that bullshit.
Right. Okay. And also to mention here, it not only gets us into debate and into this, being about the grandchildren, it also gets into the debt ceiling issue, because the more securities that the Treasury has to issue, the more it approaches the debt ceiling. So maybe it accommodates the Fed, because the Fed needs the securities, okay, to run the monetary policy, okay, that it wants to run. But at the same time, that puts the Treasury closer to the debt ceiling and brings us closer to an internal conflict inside the government between the appropriations the Treasury Department has to spend and the people in Congress who don't want to raise the debt ceiling again. So that helps to precipitate these debt ceiling crises. On the other hand, if it's the Fed doing the issuing of the security, that doesn't count towards the debt limit. The only thing that counts towards the debt limit is the principle of the Treasury debt instruments that are sold. So it never becomes a debt limit issue if the Fed is issuing the securities. So in some ways, there's been a conservative bias to the whole thing. The Fed has had the power to issue the money, okay, and to create the actual reserves the Treasury will use. Okay, and the Treasury, until the Coinage Act, did not have the capability to produce the money that it was going to spend. However, the Treasury had the authority to issue the securities that the Fed was going to need at some point to run its monetary policy. So the functions were actually the reverse of what was needed by these two agencies. The Fed needed to have the function of being able to issue the securities in order to better control its monetary policy. And the Treasury needed to have the capability to produce the reserves that it was going to need in order to implement congressional appropriations. But the way it was done in the federal government, okay, was the reverse. One of the significant aspects of the Automatic Boost to Communities Act was that it was going to fix that problem. It was going to fix that problem because it would become more institutionalized for the Fed for the Treasury to actually create its own money, while the Fed would be able to create its own securities to help it to handle monetary policy. So that's really, really an important aspect of this, I think. Anyway, going on.
So what we did in the bill was we said, look, the Treasury, if it needs to spend, it's just going to make the money and spend it. That's it. Very simple. If the Fed wants to issue securities because it needs it for monetary policy, or because it wants to give securities to investors who want to hold securities because they may not have an account at the Fed if they're not a bank, so they can't hold reserves, right? You and I can't hold reserves. Neither can Walmart, right? JP Morgan can because it has an account at the Fed. But Walmart, if Walmart wants to hold safe US dollars, it will hold it in Treasury debt. Right? So what we set it up was a system where basically the two roles would be switched. Instead of the Treasury issuing Treasury securities and the Fed turning half of it into money, we'd have the Treasury issue money and the Fed turning it half into securities. But it would be very clear that the Fed doing that had absolutely nothing to do with borrowing from our grandchildren or funding the deficit or anything like that. It was entirely to help the Fed achieve its own goals with respect to financial markets.
Okay, and that is so important. The simplification of the process and therefore the ability of people to clearly communicate these debt instruments are there for the Fed to use in draining money out of the economy when it wants to drain money out of the economy. And this capability to mint coins is there for the Treasury to use when it needs to spend the appropriations that Congress has made. Just that simplification would be essential for people to understand how public finance occurs in the United States. That is one of the things that has been really obscured and that has stood in the way of needed deficit spending for the public purpose for so long. These are things that have stood in the way of implementing a progressive agenda. And so that simplification, that simplicity that Rowan focuses on here is so important, and of course was very important as well. To me, was one of the reasons why I was so much in back of the platinum coin. And there's even a further simplification than that, okay, which we can get into, and I'll be getting into, okay, in a while. But anyway, continuing.
And other countries around the world issue central bank securities right now. So it's not an unheard of process. And ironically enough, they do it, or maybe not ironically, they do it in context where there isn't a treasury market. Often in countries where, because of the trade flows and the financial flows, those countries run a persistent budget surplus, right? Because the money is coming in elsewhere from trade surpluses. They don't need it. They don't need to run budget deficits. So in those countries, to actually ensure that there's a securities market, even when the Treasury isn't issuing any, the Fed will issue, or the central bank in those countries. So we set it up like that. Now, I don't think you actually need that in any sort of metaphysical, political sense, but we didn't want this bill to be a bill where it would take on the whole fight of ending the Treasury market. That wasn't the point of the APC Act. That's a sort of fight for a different day. So our bill was a way to say, look, the Treasury is going to stop issuing securities. We're not going to do that anymore because it's confusing and it's annoying and it misleads people about borrowing from our grandkids. But if investors still want securities, they can just go to the Fed and ask for it.
Okay, so that's the clip, okay, that I wanted to play out of this. Okay, you see the final point he makes. He did not want to actually create a situation where all those people interested in buying debt instruments would no longer have something to buy, and they would be opposed to this act for that reason. So what they were doing, okay, in the act was providing the Fed with the capability to issue debt instruments, not only for the reasons, okay, that were mentioned previously, but also for the political reason that we didn't want to have a fight with the people who need a safe instrument for investment like Treasury securities. They wouldn't have the Treasury securities anymore, but they would have the Fed securities, which of course would be just as safe, entirely guaranteed by the federal government. No risk debt instruments. And that was the key, to continue to have the no risk debt instruments for those who want to buy them. And also for the convenience of the Federal Reserve in running its monetary policy, okay, if it wanted to actually do that. So I knew this was going to take, that it wasn't going to be that short, a short take, and I'm coming on at an odd time, but I fell behind last night, so I wanted to catch up here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to end this, okay, at this point, but okay, I am going to shortly come back with some other thoughts on that, going through two pieces, okay, of mine that I actually wrote some time ago that are also relevant to how to pay for the Green New Deal, or for anything else we really need to pay for. But Deborah, thank you for coming. I don't know if anybody else, okay, is seeing this. Of course, I'm not coupling it with a Q&A because I do want to go on to some other things. But I'll be ending this for now, but I'll be coming right back with paying for the Green New Deal Part 2. So please stay tuned for that. And I'll be starting that in just a few minutes.